quite a big visit, I would say. You know, White House lunch, a press conference, together going to the Arlington cemeteries and then play golf, and also the wives have dinners. It sounds like a very full schedule. What kind of message do you think the White House is trying to send Tokyo about its relationship with Japan?
Well, I think, again, in the bargaining framework that Mr. Trump brings to these transactions, I expect that he feels if he can give a lot of face to Mr. Abe and boost the image of the U.S.-Japan relationship, Japan can be more forthcoming on locating plants in the U.S., hiring workers to fulfill Trump's campaign promises. We have an outstanding series of trade issues, mostly resolved during the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, but that's been shelved now, and so that agreement was largely beneficial to the U.S. So Trump needs to find a way to get back to that in a year or so, prepare the way to start reducing the barriers to American products getting into Japan. And they've got other issues to talk about, the value of the Japanese currency, Japanese cooperation in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and elsewhere on diplomatic and infrastructure projects, as well as Japanese cooperation on building and rebuilding American infrastructure.
Okay, are you worried, Mr. Yang, here in Beijing, that the United States, this administration, is going to put Japan as the center of its Asia strategy? Are you concerned from the Chinese side that only one voice at this point is being whispered into the ears of President Trump?
Well, for Chinese point of view, I don't think China will have a big concern about Abe's visit to the United States, although they cover quite a wide range of fundamental issues. Simply because China is confident that U.S.-China relation remains the most important bilateral relation in the world, in the Pacific. Although they are the most important bilateral alliance, the only concern China has and closely watched is how the U.S. President remarks about the Article 5 of the about their mutual defense treaty covering Diaoyu Island disputes.
All right. Well, there are a lot of things going on between Japan and the United States. Abe's gift, as some say, for Mr. Trump this time is a big one. According to some reports, first, Japan will invest about $150 billion in U.S. infrastructure in the next 10 years. Second, Japan will create 700,000 jobs and an infrastructure market worth $450 billion in the U.S. Japan is also considering importing shale gas from the U.S., which American companies find too costly to tap. It's amazing that this long list of gifts are being drawn out at this point. Some of those gifts Japan cannot even create itself back at home and already pledged to the United States. Mr. Paal, how reliable is this list? Can Mr. Abe, his administration, with the Abenomics not necessarily doing very well, the third arrow haven't been out very well, be able to fulfill this list?
Well, a lot of this is based on a survey hurriedly prepared by Mr. Abe's offices to find out what Japanese firms are already doing in the U.S. We've had a lot of interest in investing in infrastructure in the Obama administration, hasn't come to conclusion yet. And there are plans by Japanese manufacturers to expand their production in the U.S. that are driven by the lower cost of energy and the improved economic circumstances in the U.S. even before Trump came to power.
Right.
So some of this will just be certifying what we already knew or sensed was coming in the relationship. Some of it may well be new. It's like every head of state visit, they always talk big and deliver a little bit less.
If you have a big gift coming from your guest, you probably have to return somewhat favor just to make it fair. What can U.S. pledge? Is it about the so-called security cooperation? But is the U.S. shouldn't be U.S. also be concerned that Japan, when it comes to security issues in the region, is not necessarily being respected by many Asians here, given the history, given its territorial disputes with its neighbors?
Well, the U.S. is in no position to fix the history problem. What has been a watchword, at least for myself, over the years has been that Japan needs to expand its range of activities in the neighborhood it occupies, but only at a pace which is acceptable to its neighbors because of those historical questions. And so what Japan is going to do will be gradual, incremental, take a long time. I think the
well,
Trump
Mr. Paal,
administration will
when
be
you are
happy to
talking
see,
right now,
yes,
we also see some live pictures coming from Arlington Cemetery in Virginia in the United States, in which the Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, is being accompanied by his American counterpart to pay respect to the heroes lying over there. But back to the history that we are talking about. Earlier, Mr. Abe visited also Hawaii and expressed his sorrows toward the people who lost their lives in the war. And yet, in this part of the world, many are asking when Japan is going to apologize sincerely, according to the real versions of the history, to its Asian neighbors about the atrocities the Imperial Army of Japan did during the Second World War. People are asking whether there is a double standard that we are practicing in our world about history. When American lives are being lost, it's being remembered. But when many lives here in this part of the world also being lost, they're not being fairly honored. Of course, those are the live pictures coming from Arlington Memorial. Let me come back to you, Mr. Paal, about some of the most important things between Japan and the United States, security issues, for example. Do you think the Trump administration is sophisticated enough to understand the nuances of what Japan wants Washington to pledge and what might be the real impact as a result in the region? Korean Peninsula, territorial disputes, South China Sea issues, and also several kinds of bilateral, multilateral issues hanging over there. Mr. Paal.
Well, I think that different people have different levels of understanding. It's been painfully obvious that the integration of dealing with North Korea, dealing with China, Japan, the Philippines, that this integration has come together slowly for the administration. That's partly to be explained in personnel terms. If you don't have your own people in the jobs who are knowledgeable on these subjects, you have to teach new people a lot in a very short time, and it doesn't always get through. But I think we're seeing progress. I just worry a little bit because the institutional structures are still not smoothly in place.
Okay.
We saw back in 1981 when Ronald Reagan came in questioning many things. It took 6-8 months before we got to a more systemic and coherent approach to integrate regional policies. And I think it's taking a bit of that same amount of time for the Trump people.
Right.
But it's very positive to me that they had an early recognition that a solid basis with Japan is indispensable to the U.S. and that in that context, allowing the relationship with China to drift, not having a leadership exchange, would be really unacceptable to our interests as well as to China's. And therefore, they moved simultaneously on both of these fronts in ways that suggest improved understanding.
Mr. Yang, as Mr. Paal earlier indicated, from his perspective as an American scholar, it's important to see the institutional structures are working in Washington. It's also important to see the president newly coming to the office understand the sophistication of the regional relations that we are talking about. But from China's perspective, it's another issue. It's about whether Japan can really fairly treat its neighbors and the history. And
Yes.
it's also about what about the security in the region? We don't want to forget there's also Korean Peninsula issues.
Yeah.
There is issues in the South China Sea. If Japan is getting so much being heard in Washington, is there a danger, Mr. Yang, that other voices to a certain extent can be ignored or muted? And how dangerous is that?
Well, I think Japan is becoming the most important strategic variables in this regional security arena, simply because Japan is in reshaping process. Let me put it back to this. 70 years ago, after World War II, U.S. reshaped Japan from aggressive, imperialist, militarist Japan into the pacifist Japan. And then the Asian countries enjoyed a pacifist Japan for 7 decades. Now Japan is turning into something new. Abe said as the active pacifist. No one knows about the
what that means.
Yeah. However, it contains great uncertainties. What we have seen is, number one, they remain insisting on their wrong historical position.
Okay.
And number two, they are rearming. Although they constantly saying China is a military threat, they are rearming. So I'm wondering, for a long time, I've been wondering, what kind of Japan U.S. will reshape for Asia? Again, they reshaped Japan for Asia 70 years ago. Now, Japan is reshaping, pushed by the United States.